Hi, I'm Rae Whitlock, 39. At my sister's promotion ceremony, everyone stood to clap for her, until a 4-star general walked in, looked past her, and saluted me. "Commander Whitlock," he said. The room froze. My sister dropped her note cards. My mother dropped her glass. And just like that, the family's forgotten daughter wasn't invisible anymore. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. The air in Colorado Springs always felt crisp, thin, like the truth itself, especially at dawn when the mountains clawed at the sky. Growing up, our house was a monument to order, a place where the scent of starched uniforms mingled with the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Medals outshone emotions, gleaming on display cases, each one a silent testament to a life lived in service, in duty. My father, a retired major general, carried his rank even in civilian clothes, his posture rigid, his gaze sharp, always evaluating, always expecting. My mother, a former combat medic turned VA nurse, moved with a quiet efficiency, her hands capable, her words precise. Their life together was a well-oiled machine, every cog interlocking perfectly. And then there was Camila, my sister. She was the golden one, a supernova in our carefully constructed family galaxy. From the moment she could walk, she moved with purpose, her tiny fingers grasping at the concept of achievement. She wore her ambition like a tailored jacket, perfectly fitted, impeccably pressed. West Point wasn't just a dream for her, it was a foregone conclusion. She graduated top 10, her name etched in the annals of familial pride, her picture adorning our mantelpiece like a sacred icon. Her accomplishments were spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, each one a rung on the ladder to an inevitable, glorious future. Dinner scenes were often dominated by discussions of her latest triumph, her insightful comments on geopolitics, her unwavering dedication. My father would nod, a rare, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, while my mother would beam, serving up another helping of whatever Camila preferred. Even our routines revolved around her. Her study schedule dictated the quietude of the evenings, her leave dates marked on the family calendar with a solemnity usually reserved for national holidays. We would spend hours in the living room, the evening light filtering through the blinds, each of us absorbed in our own quiet activities, my father polishing his uniform buttons, my mother mending a tear in a flag, Camila poring over textbooks. Small moments, yes, but each one painting a picture of a life that felt solid, unbreakable, a world where our roles were clearly defined and everyone knew their place. And me? I was the anomaly, the discordant note in their carefully composed symphony. I left West Point after year 1, a decision that hung in the air like an unspoken accusation. Couldn't handle the structure, they'd say, a phrase delivered with a quiet disappointment that stung more than any shout. It became the narrative, the convenient explanation for my absence, my difference. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that my departure wasn't a retreat, but a redirection. While Camila marched onward in her crisp uniform, I was quietly recruited by Joint Counterintel. There was no ceremony for me, no proud parents watching from the stands, no flash of cameras, no official photos for the family album. Just a quiet conversation in a nondescript office, a hand extended, a choice presented. It was black ops, global rotations, missions with no names, no official recognition, no public record. I operated in deserts where the sand grit in my teeth felt like a constant companion, in backrooms dimly lit by the glow of computer screens, under names I didn't own, identities that shifted with each assignment. My existence became a series of calculated disappearing acts, a whisper in the shadows while Camila's life unfolded in the bright glare of public achievement. I sent my mom flowers from places I couldn't admit, the cards always signed with a generic, non-committal sentiment, hoping she'd feel the love without asking questions I couldn't answer. I watched from afar as Camila's face graced the pages of military magazines, her achievements lauded, her future seemingly limitless. In one photo on Dad's wall, a family portrait taken years ago, I'd been meticulously cropped out. The excuse given was to fit the frame. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes, a visual representation of my perceived irrelevance, my forgotten status within the family unit. My life was a phantom limb, an echo of what could have been, an absence keenly felt only by myself. And yet, there was a quiet pride in the work I did, a sense of purpose that transcended external validation. My world was one of shadows and secrets, a stark contrast to the brilliant light that always seemed to follow Camila. The silence in our house, after Camila had left for her studies or field exercises, always felt heavier, laced with an unspoken judgment. It was in these quiet moments that the seeds of doubt, microscopic at first, began to germinate. I'd notice things. Small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior, changes in routine that, on their own, meant nothing, but strung together, began to weave a tapestry of unease. My father, usually meticulous with his paperwork, would occasionally forget to sign off on a routine drill report, leaving it on the kitchen counter for my mother to find, a slight furrow in her brow as she'd pick it up. He'd dismiss it with a wave of his hand, a gruff, just tired, but it felt off. Then there were the ambiguous texts. My mother, who usually communicated in clear, concise messages about dinner plans or appointments, would send a string of ellipses after a perfectly straightforward question about Camila's whereabouts. When I'd press her, she'd shrug, "Oh, just a typo, dear." But I'd see the way her gaze would flick away, avoiding mine. A forgotten promise from Camila. She'd swear she'd call at a specific time, a routine check-in we'd established during her brief visits home, and then the call wouldn't come. Hours would stretch into days, and when I'd finally reach her, she'd offer a breezy apology, a vague excuse about a last-minute meeting or a dead phone. It wasn't the broken promise itself, but the dismissive tone, the way she'd brush it aside as if my feelings were inconsequential. There was an odd look my mother would sometimes give me. A fleeting glance, filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. Pity? Concern? Guilt? It was never sustained, always disappearing as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with a faint chill, like a draft in an otherwise warm room. I'd try to catch her eye, to ask what was wrong, but she'd busy herself with some task, her back to me, the moment lost. The atmosphere in the house, especially when Camila was home, began to feel charged. A nervous energy hummed beneath the surface of polite conversation. My father would clear his throat more often than usual, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the armrest of his chair. Camila would laugh a little too loudly at her own jokes, her eyes darting around the room, as if seeking approval, or perhaps confirmation that she was still the center of attention. I started to notice how conversations would subtly pivot whenever I brought up anything about my own life, my own experiences. A brief mention of a complicated negotiation, a challenging deployment, and the topic would quickly shift back to Camila's latest accomplishment, her upcoming promotion, the accolades she'd received. It wasn't overt, never a direct dismissal, but a slow, almost imperceptible erasure of my presence, my narrative. It felt like walking through a fog where shapes and sounds were distorted, never quite clear. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize these moments as simple oversights, stress, the natural ebb and flow of family dynamics. But the feeling persisted, a dull throb behind my temples, a growing sense of unease. It was the intuition that something was amiss, a whisper in the back of my mind that wouldn't be silenced. The air would sometimes feel heavy, almost suffocating, when Camila was talking about her military career, her voice ringing with confidence, while my parents listened with rapt attention. I'd catch a glimpse of their proud smiles, their eyes shining with admiration, and a strange emptiness would bloom in my chest. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being an outsider looking in on a world where I didn't quite belong, despite being physically present. The warmth of the family unit, once a comforting embrace, now felt distant, almost cold. It was the growing suspicion that I was being kept in the dark, that there was a secret thread weaving its way through the fabric of our lives, a thread that I couldn't see, but could undeniably feel pulling at the seams. And then, the voicemail. 12 years passed, a lifetime lived in the shadows, and then the voicemail came. A stark, clinical message from my mother. Camila's promotions next week. Don't wear anything weird. Just be respectful. No, how are you? No, we'd love to see you. Just control, a blunt reminder of my place, or rather, my lack thereof. It solidified the unease, confirming the unspoken truth that I was an obligation, an uninvited guest at a celebration that wasn't truly for me. I packed a soft blouse and my untouched dress uniform, the weight of both in my suitcase a metaphor for the internal debate raging within me. Not sure which one I'd wear. The doubt, the nagging uncertainty, had finally found a target. The hall at Fort Carson hummed with the quiet buzz of anticipation, a symphony of polished brass and strategic small talk. The air itself felt military-grade, crisp and formal, carrying the scent of freshly pressed uniforms and muted ambition. Each chair was perfectly aligned, each person a component in a meticulously arranged tableau of pride and expectation. I sat in the family, unassigned row, a phrase that felt like a quiet slap, a stark reminder of my peripheral status. It was a section reserved for those who didn't quite fit into the neat boxes of immediate family or distinguished guests, a purgatory of politeness. Camila stood at the podium, poised, powerful, rehearsed. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, resonated with a practiced confidence, each word carefully chosen, each cadence perfected. She spoke of loyalty, a concept she seemed to embody with every fiber of her being. She spoke of sacrifice, of the unwavering dedication required to serve, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the audience, each nod a silent validation. And then, her eyes, sharp and calculating, met mine for a fleeting second. She paused, a micro-expression of something akin to triumph flickering across her features, before continuing, and about knowing when people abandon the uniform. The words hung in the air, a deliberate, pointed barb, meant for me and me alone. It was a public indictment, thinly veiled but unmistakably personal. My stomach clenched, a cold knot forming in its pit. I kept my face neutral, a practice mask of impassivity that had served me well in countless covert operations. No flicker of emotion, no telltale tremor in my hands. Inside, though, a silent scream echoed, the sound of years of quiet neglect, of unacknowledged sacrifices, boiling to the surface. It was a familiar ache, a dull throb that had become a constant companion throughout my life, a reminder of the chasm that separated me from my family. The words were a direct assault, a public humiliation masked as a noble sentiment. They were designed to cut, to diminish, to solidify my perceived failure in the eyes of everyone present, especially my parents. The weight of her gaze, even for that brief second, felt heavy, like a physical burden. I felt the familiar urge to disappear, to dissolve into the anonymity that had become my refuge. To simply vanish from the room, from their lives, to become the ghost they already believed me to be. The betrayal wasn't just in the words, but in the calculated delivery, the cold precision with which she had wielded them. It was a betrayal of unspoken family bonds, a deliberate act of public shaming. I could feel the hushed whispers, the curious glances of those around me, their eyes flicking between me and Camila, their minds piecing together the unspoken narrative. The air in the room, already stiff with formality, grew heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. Each breath felt like an effort, each beat of my heart a painful reminder of the quiet devastation unfolding within me. This wasn't a sudden explosion, a dramatic outburst of anger or tears. It was a quiet devastation, a shattering of an already fragile sense of belonging. My world, already precariously balanced, tilted violently on its axis, threatening to plunge me into an abyss of despair. The grief was a slow, creeping chill, seeping into my bones, numbing me to everything but the raw pain of being exposed, judged, and dismissed. Disbelief warred with a grim recognition. I had always known, deep down, that I was an outsider, but to have it so explicitly, so publicly confirmed, was a different kind of wound. It was a wound that cut deeper than any physical injury, a laceration on the very fabric of my identity. This was the pivotal moment, the precise instant when everything changed, irrevocably. A low hum of conversation, a polite murmur that filled the silence after Camila's thinly veiled jab, was abruptly cut short. A hush fell over the assembled officers and their families, a ripple of anticipation spreading through the rows. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall swung inward with a quiet thud, and General Marcus Ellington walked in. He was a figure of quiet authority, his presence commanding immediate respect without needing a single word. His uniform, adorned with a multitude of ribbons and medals, spoke volumes of a career dedicated to service, to leadership. He scanned the crowd, his gaze moving with practiced ease, bypassing dozens of eager salutes, ignoring the stiff postures of officers hoping to catch his eye. And then he stopped. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, cut through the polite facade of the room, through the rows of uniforms and civilian attire. They found me. He walked toward my row, his steps measured, deliberate, each stride echoing with purpose. The air crackled with a sudden, almost tangible tension. Every eye in the room followed his progress, their gazes shifting from the towering general to the quiet woman in the family, unassigned row. He stopped directly in front of me. He saluted me. Sharp, public, unmistakably formal. "Ma'am, Commander Whitlock. It's an honor to see you again." The words, delivered with a quiet sincerity that resonated through the hushed hall, were a seismic shock. They were a direct contradiction to everything Camila had just implied, to everything my family believed about me. The weight of those words, the unexpected validation, hit me with an intensity that stole my breath. Camila's voice, which had moments before rung with confident self-assurance, cracked, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound, as if her carefully constructed world had developed a sudden, irreparable fissure. Her note cards, held loosely in her trembling hand, slipped from her grasp, scattering across the podium like fallen leaves. My mother's water glass, gripped tightly in her hand, hit the floor with a sharp, echoing crash, shattering the stunned silence into 1,000 tiny fragments. The sound was jarring, a stark punctuation mark to the unbelievable reality unfolding before everyone's eyes. Even my father, usually so composed, so rigidly self-controlled, stood halfway, a figure frozen between sitting and standing, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He seemed unsure of how to respond, how to process the seismic shift in the carefully maintained family narrative. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, twitched, as if reaching for an answer that eluded him. I returned the salute. Not for validation, not for a moment did I seek their approval or acceptance, but because you never leave a soldier standing alone. It was a silent acknowledgement of a shared understanding, a bond forged in a world they knew nothing about. It was a gesture of respect for the uniform, for the man before me, and for the life I had chosen, the life they had so vehemently dismissed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of shock, vindication, and a strange, quiet sorrow. The world, which had felt so out of focus just moments before, snapped into agonizing clarity. The betrayal was real, the slight deliberate, but so, too, was the truth of my own existence, a truth revealed in the most public and unexpected way. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with shattered illusions, and with the sudden, undeniable weight of a hidden reality. That night, the guest quarters felt different. The air, usually heavy with the lingering scent of stale politeness, now thrummed with a nervous energy, a silent aftershock of the day's events. I sat on the edge of the bed, the unexpected public validation from General Ellington still reverberating through me, a strange mix of triumph and an unsettling awareness of what it truly meant. My phone, usually a lifeline to a world they knew nothing about, lay silent beside me. I was preparing to pack, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of my family's expectations, when my fingers brushed against something tucked beneath the pillow. A plain envelope. No fancy script, no official seal, just stark, unadorned paper. My breath hitched. A cold premonition, a creeping dread, settled in my stomach. Inside was a printed scan of a classified allegation about me. My blood ran cold. The words on the page blurred for a moment, then sharpened into agonizing clarity. Unsanctioned mission. Civilian deaths. My mind raced, flashing back to a dark chapter, a desperate operation, a no-win scenario where lives were lost despite every precaution. The phrasing, though, was what truly jolted me. It was lifted, almost verbatim, from a post-mission report I'd painstakingly written, a document accessible only to 3 people. 3 people entrusted with the most sensitive information, the most vulnerable truths. One of them was Camila. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. A sharp, burning pain bloomed in my chest, a deeper wound than any battlefield injury. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a weaponized truth, twisted and distorted, designed to inflict maximum damage. The anger, usually a controlled, precise instrument for me, flared into an inferno. My hands trembled, the paper rustling softly as I gripped it tighter. Disbelief warred with a bitter certainty. My own sister, the golden girl, the paragon of virtue, had taken my deepest vulnerability, my professional trauma, and weaponized it. The betrayal wasn't a slow burn, not a creeping suspicion. It was a sudden, violent eruption, tearing apart the last vestiges of trust one had unknowingly harbored. The quiet devastation I'd felt earlier in the hall was nothing compared to this. This was a profound, soul-deep hurt, a betrayal that reached into the very core of my identity. My mind reeled, trying to process the magnitude of her action, the cold calculation behind it. To use my own report, my own words, against me. It was a level of malice I hadn't thought her capable of. This wasn't just about ambition anymore. It was about tearing down, about destroying. I confronted her the next day. The air between us was colder than protocol, colder than any winter in Colorado. She stood stiffly in the living room, bathed in the unforgiving morning light filtering through the windows, her face a carefully constructed mask of defiance. I held out the printed allegation, my hand steady despite the tremor in my voice. "This came from you, didn't it?" She didn't deny it. No bluster, no elaborate excuses, no feigned shock. Her gaze, usually so direct, skittered away for a moment, then returned, hardening with a cold, desperate resolve. "You left," she said, her voice low, laced with a bitterness that surprised me. "You don't get to disappear and still outshine me." The words hung in the air, heavy with a lifetime of unspoken resentments, of perceived slights, of a desperate need for recognition. It wasn't about the mission, about the classified information. It was about me, about her perceived inferiority, her constant struggle to measure up, to escape my shadow, a shadow I hadn't even known I cast. She sounded like the little girl who used to trail behind me in the yard, her small voice whining, "Wait for me, Rae. Don't go so fast." But this time, the childish plea had twisted into something venomous, something sharp and destructive. This time, the knife had landed. It plunged deep, twisting with every word, severing the last threads of familial connection. The pain was excruciating, raw and visceral. This wasn't a wound that would heal quickly or easily. This was a betrayal that would leave a permanent scar, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of trust, even within the closest of bonds. My world had not only shifted, it had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The silence that followed her confession was deafening, filled only by the echoes of her cutting words. I didn't press charges. The thought flickered, a fleeting desire for justice, for retribution, but it quickly faded. What was the point? The damage was already done, the betrayal etched deep into my soul. Instead, a strange, quiet calm settled over me. It wasn't resignation, but something far more potent, a nascent resolve. The initial shock had given way to a steely determination, a cold clarity that cut through the emotional haze. I wouldn't allow her actions to define me, to derail me. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about reestablishing my own narrative, reclaiming my own strength. The universe, in its own twisted way, seemed to align with my newfound resolve. A week later, I was assigned to lead the internal leak investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, the victim of the leak, was now tasked with uncovering its source. My team? A chillingly familiar roster. My father, managing the intel logs, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by a rigid discomfort that bordered on apprehension. My mother, assisting forensic review, her hands moving with an uncharacteristic slowness, her gaze avoiding mine. And Camila, tracing system access, her face a mask of strained composure, her movements stiff and unnatural. The air in the secure facility was colder than protocol, colder than any Arctic wind. Each day was a tightrope walk, every interaction a subtle dance of unspoken accusations and raw, simmering resentment. We worked in silence, the only sounds the soft click of keyboards and the rustle of papers. My internal monologue became my constant companion, a quiet hum of observation and strategic thought. I watched them, my parents, Camila. I saw the subtle tells, the fleeting glances, the unconscious gestures that revealed their discomfort, their guilt, their fear. I was no longer just a victim. I was an observer, a meticulous analyst of human behavior. I was gathering not just evidence for the case, but insights into the twisted dynamics that had governed my life. There was no room for anger, no space for emotional outbursts. My focus was razor-sharp, my mind a finely tuned instrument. I delved into the digital forensics, traced the breadcrumbs of access logs, cross-referenced timestamps with an almost surgical precision. Every piece of data, every line of code, was a potential clue, a fragment of the truth. I worked tirelessly, fueled by a quiet, simmering resolve that pulsed beneath the surface. It was a strength born not of rage, but of a deep, almost instinctual need to reclaim control, to rewrite the narrative that had been so cruelly imposed upon me. During our methodical, painstaking dig, we found something buried, something that shifted the entire landscape of the situation. It wasn't what I expected, yet in a strange way, it made a terrible kind of sense. A dormant Trojan, a sophisticated piece of malware, planted years ago by a bitter strategist I had once exposed during an overseas operation. A man whose career I had, inadvertently, destroyed. He had nursed a grudge, a slow-burning venom that had finally found its moment to strike. Camila had triggered it. Unintentionally. The revelation was a gut punch, not because it absolved her completely, but because it added a layer of complexity I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a direct, malicious act of hacking on her part. She hadn't intentionally sought out and unleashed the Trojan. Her intention was still to wound me, to expose my vulnerabilities, but she had done so by unknowingly activating a pre-existing weapon. The internal report, the one she had accessed, was contaminated. She had pulled a poisoned arrow from a quiver she didn't realize was booby-trapped. The shift in the room was palpable. My father's rigid posture softened, a flicker of something akin to relief, or perhaps profound disappointment, crossing his face. My mother's eyes, which had been downcast, finally met mine, a silent plea for understanding, for something I couldn't yet name. Camila, her face drained of color, finally broke. The mask shattered, revealing the raw vulnerability beneath. She confessed. No excuses, no attempts to deflect blame. Just a quiet, broken admission of what she had done, how she had accessed the report, her intention to hurt me, and the horrifying, unintended consequence of unleashing something far larger than she could have imagined. She accepted a reprimand. She lost promotion eligibility, a crushing blow to a woman who had built her entire identity around professional ascent. But there was no dramatic scene, no public tearing down. Just a signed report, a quiet acknowledgement of consequences. Something changed that day. The air, which had been thick with resentment, thinned, allowing a sliver of fragile possibility to break through. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, a crack in the hardened shell of betrayal, allowing a glimmer of light to filter in. A quiet, resilient strength began to form within me, not a vengeful rage, but a careful, strategic resolve. I was no longer just observing. I was preparing, gathering my strength, readying myself for the next stage of this unexpected, deeply personal journey. Weeks later, the air in the old house felt different. Lighter. Or perhaps, I was simply breathing more freely. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards underfoot, the familiar scent of old books and polish, they no longer felt like accusations. They felt like echoes of a home, a place that, despite everything, still held a fragile sense of belonging. I invited them all to dinner at the old house. The decision was not born of forgiveness, but of a calculated, deliberate choice. It was a turning point, not just for them, but for me. I needed to speak my truth, to lay bare the years of silence and unspoken pain, not to punish, but to liberate myself. I set the table, meticulously, as if each plate, each fork, was a piece in a delicate negotiation. My hands moved with a quiet precision, mirroring the deliberate way I had pieced together the fragments of the Trojan's code. I took Dad's old seat at the head of the table, a symbolic reclaiming of space, of authority, that felt both strange and empowering. The light from the setting sun streamed through the dining room window, casting long shadows that stretched across the worn wooden floor. I didn't ask for apologies. What would they even mean after so many years, so much unspoken hurt? Words felt hollow, inadequate. I gave them the truth. Not a gentle, sugar-coated version, but the raw, unvarnished reality of my life in the shadows. My voice was steady, calm, almost detached, as if I were narrating someone else's story. I told them what I'd done. The quiet victories, the impossible odds, the clandestine operations that had shaped me into the woman sitting before them. I told them who I'd saved, the faces of those I'd pulled from the jaws of danger, the lives I'd protected, flashed through my mind, a silent testament to a purpose they had never acknowledged. And then I told them who I'd lost. The weight of those losses, the ghosts that walked beside me, the sacrifices that had left their indelible mark. My voice didn't break, but I could feel the tremor deep within my chest, a physical manifestation of the memories that surged to the surface. Their faces were a canvas of emotions. My father, his usual stoicism fractured by a profound sadness. My mother, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and understanding, a quiet grief settling over her features. Camila, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped, the weight of her own actions heavy upon her. I slid the printed email to Camila. The classified allegation, the one that had revealed her unwitting betrayal, lay between us on the polished wood. I kept this, I said, my voice low, but carrying a weight that resonated through the quiet room, not to hurt you, but to remind you that silence can wound just as deeply. It was a statement, not an accusation. A truth laid bare, a mirror reflecting the years of their deliberate blindness, their unspoken judgment, their casual dismissal of my existence. The silence that followed was profound, thick with unspoken regrets and a dawning understanding. My father, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly, picked up an old photo from the table. It was a faded image of us as children, Camila and I, standing awkwardly, a gap between us that felt symbolic even then. He traced the outline of my cropped-out figure with his thumb. "This one's missing someone," he said, his voice rough with emotion, a vulnerability I had never heard before. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, clear and unblinking. "We'll take a new one." It wasn't an apology, not in words. But it was more. It was an acknowledgement. A tacit admission of past mistakes, of years of misplaced priorities, of a daughter overlooked and misunderstood. It was a promise of a future, a new narrative to be written together. The weight lifted from my shoulders, not completely, not entirely, but enough to feel the first stirrings of peace. The quiet revenge wasn't about tearing them down, but about building myself up, about forcing them to see the truth, to acknowledge the reality they had so stubbornly denied. It was a subtle shift, a quiet turning of the tables, where the betrayer finally felt the subtle, pervasive consequences of their actions, not through retribution, but through the undeniable weight of their own conscience. The true revolution wasn't in their downfall, but in my quiet, deliberate rise. The unraveling was slow, almost imperceptible at first, like a fraying thread at the edge of a perfectly woven tapestry. For Camila, it wasn't a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a gradual erosion. Socially, the whispers began. Not malicious gossip, but a quiet, polite distancing from colleagues, from friends who had once admired her unwavering assent. The military community, while adhering to its strict protocols, had its own subtle ways of expressing disapproval. The reprimand, the loss of promotion eligibility, these were formal blows, but the informal ones, the missed invitations to social gatherings, the slightly cooler greetings, the lack of genuine warmth in conversations, were far more insidious. She found herself increasingly on the periphery, no longer the celebrated prodigy, but a person quietly marked, her once pristine image subtly tarnished. Financially, the impact was less direct but no less significant. The missed promotion meant a stalled salary, a plateauing of her earning potential. The prestige that had once opened doors, secured preferential treatment, now felt less potent. She was still confident, still dedicated, but the shimmering aura of inevitable success that had once surrounded her had faded, replaced by a quiet, almost imperceptible air of stagnation. Emotionally, the consequences were perhaps the most profound. The burden of the truth, the quiet confession, weighed heavily on her. I saw it in her eyes, in the subtle slump of her shoulders, in the way she sometimes stared blankly into space, lost in thought. The drive, the relentless ambition that had defined her, seemed to have been tempered, replaced by a more subdued, introspective demeanor. Her world, once so carefully constructed around external validation and achievement, was forced to recenter, to grapple with a new, less flattering reality. For me, the process was one of slow, deliberate healing. It wasn't about punishing Camila or watching her suffer. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by piece, from the wreckage of their expectations and her betrayal. The quiet observations during the investigation had been just the beginning. The real work began after the dinner, after the unspoken acknowledgement. I started small, reconnecting with old friends from my days before West Point, people who knew Rae, not just the Rae defined by her family's perceptions. There was a sense of lightness in these interactions, a freedom from the constant need to prove myself, to explain my existence. I found solace in long walks in the Colorado mountains, the vast, silent expanse of balm to my fractured spirit. The biting wind felt cleansing, the crisp air filling my lungs with something akin to hope. I journaled, filling pages with thoughts and feelings I had suppressed for years, a torrent of unspoken pain and quiet triumphs. It was a way of externalizing the internal monologue, giving shape to the amorphous emotions that had haunted me. I sought out therapy, a conscious decision to process the trauma of betrayal, to untangle the knots of resentment and hurt that had become so deeply embedded. It was a difficult, often painful process, but each session was a step towards true liberation, a chipping away at the emotional armor I had built around myself. The process of reclaiming my peace was gradual, like the slow melting of a deep snowpack in spring. It wasn't a sudden burst of sunshine, but a steady drip, drip, drip of emotional thawing. I learned to distinguish between healthy boundaries and emotional walls. I found strength in vulnerability, allowing myself to feel the pain, to acknowledge the hurt, without letting it consume me. I began to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about integrating the experience into who I was becoming. The betrayal, the public humiliation, the quiet struggle, they were all part of my story, not defining features, but chapters that had shaped my resilience. I started to invest in my own well-being, prioritizing self-care in a way I never had before. Simple things, a hot bath after a long week, a quiet morning with a cup of coffee and a good book, time spent in nature, letting the vastness of the world remind me of my own small but significant place within it. I found joy in mundane tasks, in the rhythmic motion of chopping vegetables for a meal, in the feel of clean sheets against my skin. These small moments, once overlooked, now felt profoundly meaningful, anchors in the chaotic seas of my past. My relationship with my parents also began a slow, hesitant process of repair. It wasn't a sudden embrace, but a series of tentative steps. My mother started writing me short letters, not about Camila, not about family expectations, but about her day, about the garden she was planting, about a new book she was reading. They were small, personal gestures, a bridge being built across the chasm of silence. My father, always a man of few words, surprised me with a quiet request to hear more about my work, about the places I'd been, the challenges I'd faced. He started telling people, "My daughter works with NATO," a simple statement that nonetheless felt like a monumental shift, a public acknowledgement of my professional life, my existence beyond the family narrative he had clung to for so long. The consequences of betrayal, for both the betrayer and the betrayed, were complex and multifaceted. For Camila, it was a reevaluation of her values, a forced reckoning with the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition. For me, it was a journey from quiet devastation to resilient strength, a profound transformation that reshaped my understanding of self, family, and true liberation. The process of healing wasn't linear, but it was real. It was about finding my own peace, not through vengeance, but through acceptance, self-compassion, and a fierce determination to thrive. It was about reclaiming my narrative, defining my own worth, and stepping into the light of my own truth, no longer content to be a ghost in the family photos. These days, I teach counterintel strategy once a month. The classroom is dimly lit, the faces before me a mix of fresh recruits and seasoned officers, all hungry for the knowledge that can mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. I stand at the front, my voice calm, authoritative, sharing lessons learned in the crucible of shadows and silence. It's a way of giving back, of imparting the wisdom gleaned from years of operating beyond the visible lines, in the quiet spaces where national security truly takes shape. Camila attends every session. She sits in the back, usually in the same seat, a quiet observer. She doesn't seek attention, doesn't try to interject. She just listens, her gaze fixed on me, a mixture of respect and something akin to quiet awe in her eyes. She asks hard questions, probing, insightful, demonstrating a newfound intellectual curiosity that transcends mere ambition. She listens with an intensity that tells me she's not just hearing the words, but absorbing the lessons, understanding the nuances of a world she once dismissed. It's not an apology, not in spoken words, but in her unwavering presence, her genuine engagement. It's a profound acknowledgement. My mother writes me short letters now, not just about her garden, but about her thoughts, her feelings, her own quiet reflections on life. They are simple, heartfelt dispatches, devoid of judgment or expectation. A bond is slowly, tentatively, reforming, built on honesty and a newfound appreciation for the quiet moments. My father tells people my daughter works with NATO. He says it with a quiet pride now, a simple, declarative statement that speaks volumes. The old photo, the one where I was cropped out, is gone from the wall. In its place is a new one, taken casually during a rare family gathering. It's a bit blurry, taken by a timer, but we're all there, unposed, unedited, standing close, a genuine smile on my face. No frame can hold all of what I've lived. The vastness of my experiences, the depths of my pain, the heights of my resilience, they defy easy categorization, neat labels. The narrative they constructed, the one I used to believe, was a narrow, confining box. But maybe now I don't need it to. I don't need their understanding to validate my existence. My validation comes from within, from the quiet strength I've forged in the crucible of betrayal and resilience. Some battles aren't fought on battlefields with uniforms and heavy artillery. They're fought in living rooms, at empty dinner tables, and in quiet glances where unspoken truths sting more than any bullet. They are fought within ourselves, against the narratives others impose upon us, against the pain that threatens to consume us. And sometimes, the deepest victory isn't being seen, not in the way they thought, not through public accolades or superficial recognition. It's finally being understood, not by them, but by myself. It's the clarity that comes from walking through fire and emerging not unscathed, but stronger, more resilient, more authentically myself. It's the quiet liberation of letting go of bitterness, not through forgiveness, but through acceptance of what was and the unwavering commitment to what is yet to be. It's a resolution not just of plot, but of self, a profound sense of peace that resonates deep within my bones. The lingering question is not for them, but for you. Have you found your way back from betrayal?